Roman Abramovich was the first person. So he created that paradigm shift. And then everyone else was scrambling to catch up with him. A lot of African players who never quite settled in the Premier League, never quite felt comfortable, I think you could see almost, in their surroundings. And you could see some very talented players over the years not quite find their niche. Obviously, sports like rugby and cricket, I think they're fantastic sports, and obviously a lot of people do. But another challenge would be making it accessible in terms of understanding.
Welcome to the Football Economy, where we dive into the business behind the beautiful game. I'm your host, Ibrahim, and today we're exploring the power of storytelling in football and the journalists who shape how we see the sport behind the pitch. Joining me today is Nick Purewal, an award-winning journalist with 20 years of experience covering sport at elite level, from his early days at Grimsby Telegraph to his role as Chelsea correspondent at the Press Association. Nick has been at the forefront of the game's biggest stories. He wrote the much-talked-about new book, Sanctioned, the inside story of the sale of Chelsea. If you're curious about how football is covered, who shapes the narrative, and why it matters, this episode is definitely for you. Nick, welcome to the Football Economy.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so let's kick on. So the first thing I'd like to ask is just a bit of background into who you are. So obviously you cover sports, you have an understanding of the ecosystem, obviously football especially, but can you just dial it back to when you're probably under 10 years old and trying to figure out what you wanted to do in the grand scheme of things in terms of the world? Would you say you're on the same path as that 10-year-old envisioning what he would be in the future?
Yeah, I haven't thought about that for a while, but yes, I think, I would. And that's really, when I look at it like that, that's quite pleasing because, I loved football and sport from, the word go. My dad, so I'm a Coventry City fan, and grew up in Coventry. My dad was a doctor, so we moved around, but we ended up settling back in Coventry, and so I grew up. And I was 6 when Coventry won the FA Cup in 1987, and that was the first year I started going to football matches with my dad taking me, and that kind of really, I suppose, really sparked my love for football and Coventry. And yeah, I mean, my dad really understood the game tactically and still does to a really, really high level. So when we were watching matches, just having fun, he'd be just explaining everything about what was happening and systems and ideas and without really knowing what was happening, I was just learning about the game and the intricacies of it all the time. I couldn't have had a better teacher in that respect, by obviously fortune and default. And so yeah, I kind of, I knew I loved football as sport and played rugby as well to a high level, decent level, growing up. So, I sort of didn't really think too much about what I was wanting to do in terms of my career, other than I thought that, being a sports journalist would be more of a dream than anything else. It's one of those jobs, I think, when you're young, you look at it and you wonder how people, get to do something like that. Do you know what I mean? So it's something I would have not dwelt on too much, just focus my energies into my studies and exams and things. And then when I came out the other side of university, when I started thinking seriously about what I was going to do with my life, that's when it occurred to me that that's what what my passion was and what I should focus my energies on. So I trained as a journalist and worked in news, and then eventually got a break into sports journalism, and yeah, haven't looked back. And yeah, so that was probably always the thing I would have first thought of as being a bit of a dream job. And I'm extremely fortunate that that's how it's panned out.
And what was the aha moment in university or during that period where you felt, okay, this is the specific, this should be my specific focus in terms of paving a path for myself?
Yeah, I think I just think I was focused on making sure I would do as well as I could in my studies, and also trying to enjoy the university experience and not really worrying too much about careers at that point. I've always been somebody who kind of takes things one step at a time. The sports cliche would be, the sports terminology would be next job focused. And at the time, I didn't know that's what I was doing, but I was doing that. And so, and that's been very fortunate for me. It's kind of worked out in my favor, because I think when I was younger, the times when I started thinking about the bigger picture and, 4 or 5, 6, maybe even more steps ahead, I'd not that it stressed me out, but it would start to feel that it wasn't achievable. So I think I quite quickly, even, within my own head, just sort of brought things back and just thought, right, break it down, you know, what's today's challenge or what's this week's challenge, and just focus on that, and let the rest of it take care of itself. And so, when people say control the controllables in sport, yes, that's a cliche, but it's true as well. It's really good advice. I think it's really good advice for sport, and it's really good advice for life. That really helped me. And yeah, I think towards the end of my university degree, I was sort of thinking about what I was going to do next. I actually started an MA. And then in the first term of that, I actually withdrew, because that was the point at which I decided that I wanted to be a journalist. And then so the MA wasn't relevant to my future career. And so speaking with people at the university, they sort of said, look, if you've decided what you want to do, then basically don't waste time, and go and sort of change tack now. So I did, and I think that was probably one of the best things I did do, because I spent the rest of that year gaining work experience at newspapers and other media organizations, and that really stood me in massive stead for everything that came after that. So yeah, I think sometimes the sports journalism industry looks like it's something that's I think it could easily be something you look at and think it's impenetrable, but I promise anyone who's listening, it's absolutely not. And it's difficult to get into it, and it's something that obviously a lot of people want to do. But I think if you're dedicated, focused, and hardworking, and you understand sport, then you'll always have a chance.
Right. And I did mention in the introduction that you obviously had a early focus and still a focus on rugby. My question to you is what is the sort of like the intersection between rugby and football from a decision making lens? So the people behind the scenes, the owners, the executives, are they similar characters in that way, or is it very distinct?
Yeah, I mean, I think they are, and I think rugby is obviously very, very young in terms of professionalism, having turned pro in the 90s, and it's still trying to work out how it's still trying to make professionalism work for the sport, really. So there's still a lot of amateur elements to the sport, which and I don't mean that as a criticism. That's a real positive for the sport, because it's still very close to the fans, are still accessible for the supporters. Clubs really are kind of reliant on the really strong bonds players and coaches and executives will have with their core support. And I think that's something that will really appeal to fans, because you can get extremely close to what's going on and you can be involved in it. And I think that's a good thing. It has followed the model of football. And in some ways, it's fallen slightly foul of that at points, and has had to kind of row back. But yeah, I mean, most of the clubs, certainly in the UK and France, the big clubs are owned by wealthy investors, and they obviously invest heavily. So in England, the game is trying to push towards sustainability from ownership and investment. But that's obviously really, it's a very difficult challenge. It's a very noble aim, but I think it's something that's always going to be an uphill struggle given wages and all those sorts of things. And then but yeah, I mean, so there've been a few mistakes along the way at a sort of decision-making level of the game in trying to replicate things that football has done. But I'd like to think that the game's at the stage where they understand what those mistakes have been, and has probably sort of stepped back a bit from them. And so I think there's a lot of positive lessons that football can give to sports like rugby. But I think the one thing I would say is that the biggest thing is you've got to protect your core support. I think we see it with cricket and the 100 and things like that, don't we? That you can completely understand why decision makers in the sport will want to try and open the sport up to a new audience, and that's important. But in terms of people who've got the time and the funds and the opportunity to pay to attend matches, they're invariably older people. Not old people, but people who are in established adulthood, aren't they? So they've got disposable income basically and disposable time. So by that stage, those people have effectively made up their minds about what they want to spend that disposable income and time on in terms of sport. And so I think then the challenge for the sports that are the smaller sports around football is to protect and the core support they have, and make sure they're always giving those guys, those people, the best value for money, I think. And that's obviously has to be balanced by trying to grow the game and bring new people in and sort of spread the word and bring, obviously capture the interest and imagination of the younger generations. But you've got to do the two things at the same time. The difference with football is obviously that football doesn't really have to try to capture anyone's imagination, does it, or anything like that. It's just, it's such a global game. And I think obviously the beauty of, people call it the beautiful game, and that's in its simplicity, isn't it? You can watch a football match in a park or put a football match on the TV. And if you've never seen it before, it won't take you many minutes to understand what's happening or what the aim of the game is. And so, within that, absolute simplicity of the game is the thing that draws people in. And then obviously it has endless intricacies, and that holds people's attention too. So I think obviously sports like rugby and cricket, I think they're fantastic sports, and obviously a lot of people do. But another challenge would be making it accessible in terms of understanding the rules and the laws and everything that goes with it for a new audience. So yeah, there are similarities. There's definitely kind of crossover points, but at the same time, I think rugby especially faces a lot of challenges that football just wouldn't really have to even consider.
I understood. And in terms of how you found yourself working with Chelsea, could you paint that picture for us?
Yeah, so I had been working for the Press Association, which is the UK's main news agency, for a number of years, and I was covering Premier League football in London and also covering Ireland's test matches in rugby as well. So a bit of a split role, but based in London and predominantly covering Premier League football. So I was covering all the clubs really and sort of filling in where necessary. And that was great because it allowed me to cover a variety of different clubs and build a contact base and everything. And then when somebody left, I threw my hat into the ring for the Chelsea job and was appointed to that, which was fantastic. So that was how I came to be covering Chelsea regularly at the back end of 2019. So then obviously things progressed from there. And yeah, obviously the sale happened in 2022.
Yeah, and then talking about the sale, so that's like a very good, pivot to it. Um, so just peeling it back before we get really into the book itself, if I'm not mistaken, most people would not have foreseen, the UK government actually going as not as aggressive when it comes to the sanctions of highly placed Russian high net worth individuals, specifically talking about here Roman Abramovich. So, considering the fact that you had like insider knowledge into the football industry, but also specifically around Chelsea when it comes to the press association, would you have said you would have seen what we're currently, currently dealing with in terms of Roman obviously being sanctioned, his club being stripped away from him? Would you have foreseen the situation, or do you think this was just something that, as the situation developed with the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this would have been the natural consequence of it?
Yeah, I think that certainly this wouldn't have been something I knew at the time, but it would be something that I would, learn as things unfolded. That the UK government, certainly Roman Abramovich's people, felt that the UK government had been trying to find ways to sanction him ever since the Skripal poisoning of 2018, and so really, relations between the UK and Russia changed overnight off the back of that incident, which is understandable. And the UK kicked out, expelled a record number of Russian diplomats, and Russia responded similarly. And then, so yeah, the relations between the two countries completely changed, and attitudes towards Russians in the UK from a government level changed too. And certainly Roman Abramovich felt that quite keenly. But the UK government, couldn't find, or hadn't been able to find, any basis for sanctioning Roman Abramovich, and which is obviously backed up by the fact that he wasn't sanctioned. And then ultimately the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, completely changed the parameters of what would be required for a sort of a burden of proof, if you like, for sanctioning, which is again, it's also understandable. So then I think as soon as the war broke out, I think Roman Abramovich and his people were aware that something might come down the line, and they were hoping that it wouldn't happen, but obviously eventually it did. So yeah, I think it's yeah, you could break it down into two things really. The two key events that completely, created a shift in sort of mindset and attitude. And the first of that would be Skripal, and the second would be Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, it after reading the book, it comes across to me that there's Roman definitely going to speak up again in depth to later time, almost like a post sequel to the book in terms of trying to frame his time in Chelsea, because this book was more about the sale of the club itself. So obviously we don't know what it took to get Chelsea to where it was, where it became a dominant English club, a European club, a truly transformative time, especially when you consider the fact that his entrance into English football created the catalyst for the UAE to come in, other American investors, but also the race to make sure that the Premier League was hyper commercialized. But you did meet him in Istanbul in 2024, and then obviously in 2025 in January,
Mm.
you met him also. So explain to us sort of like the psychology of this high net worth individual with enormous power when it comes to his dealings in Russia, which is specifically his companies, and then obviously enormous influence when it comes to the football ecosystem, considering the fact that he owned Chelsea for a very long time. What was the sort of the psychology of the man you were talking to? You were talking to him through a translator, but he doesn't understand English, and you said
Mm.
his English is quite good.
Yeah.
You just paint that picture for us to understand how someone comes to accept the events that are happening as a result of his obviously alleged association to Russian President Vladimir Putin in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely, and absolutely, and you said alleged, and the key thing there is that's those allegations. Roman Abramovich has always refuted, very very strongly, and no, I think he has always been, and his people would have always said this about him. He's always been somebody who makes very very once it's time to make a decision, once he's ready to make a decision, it would be something that's very very swift, and very quick and acted upon. And he's not somebody who looks back on things, and so I think he would stress test things greatly, but then act and not second guess or dwell on things. And I think this was exactly the same. Obviously, this was out of his hands, but he said to me, there's a quote in the book. We had 50 good years and now something else. And I think for somebody who came from nothing, he was orphaned before the age of 4, by the age of 4, and raised by grandparents, and came from absolutely nothing and built from that, a very successful import-export business, a trading business, and then obviously went from there and amassed, huge wealth. He, I think, is somebody who is quite phlegmatic about changes of circumstances, and is someone who clearly um, handled hard times, grew up in quite difficult circumstances that I think it's quite hard for, people like me, and we've grown up only in England, in the UK, to understand really. So I wouldn't try to pretend I would understand that, but I can obviously see that it'd be extremely difficult and there'd be lots of challenges along the way. And so I think there's someone who's had that background, but who's always stayed very focused, very driven. I think he's someone who's very prepared and comfortable with change, and
Mm.
dealing with and being I suppose comfortable being uncomfortable, which is another sports cliche, isn't it? But I think that's a truism of him too. So he was remarkably sanguine about the whole thing, and while obviously he wasn't happy with the sanctions or he wouldn't agree with them, he was understanding of the situation and did try to sort of take a step back as much as he could. And so he tried to, I think through his actions putting Chelsea up for sale in the first place, I think that was a gesture to almost to say to the government, this is me taking a step back, and I hope that I think I know what's coming. I hope it doesn't come, but if it does, please take into consideration effectively, what I'm doing here, which is effectively saying, oh, if that happens, then I'll make it easy on everybody, or as easy as possible. And so, yeah, remarkably relaxed about the whole thing. But then everybody says, and I certainly found it when I met him, that he's very calm, generally very calm, but very very measured and focused. So I think they're all traits that really would really help people keep a level head and be able to be successful in business.
Yeah, I think probably just me speculating here. I think one reason why he might be calm about the situation is that he's made sure that the funds go to charitable causes, and I think obviously you all know this more than I do that Roman is a very charitable individual, considering the fact that a lot of wealthy people are not as charitable in that sense. Potentially knowing that the funds will be going to that sort of causes to benefit people who have obviously been impacted by the war in Ukraine, but also war and refugee situations around the world. I think that's probably a motivational factor that at least the money goes to a good use. Hopefully it does. But so one person, this central figure, central story, one particular figure that is very interesting to me that I would like to actually dive into is Marina. So as you know, Marina has been central to Roman's army, as they say in Chelsea. But she's a remarkable figure in the sense that at a time when women were not even represented in leadership roles in football, until today they're not, if I'm being honest. We're talking about the
Mm.
men's game.
Yeah.
Marina stands out in terms of her pivotal role in shaping Chelsea, kind of in her image in a way, because she was given the keys after
Mm.
obviously improving her prowess in that sense. My question to you is around the backing of Didier Drogba. I didn't even know this. Well, I'm not a Chelsea fan, but I'm a football fan. I didn't even know this, and I was reading this through the book. Obviously, I knew the incident with Drogba and the referee in the
Mm.
Champions League. Obviously,
Mm.
Drogba, like every other high performing individual, has like their not so good side, let's say. Um, and she was able to back him in a time when a lot of executives, a lot of pressure was coming around that particular player and saying that he should not be supported. We should look past him. And she felt that she could stake her career in or her role on Drogba, and it paid off massively for not just the club, but for her and Roman also and Chelsea fans, which is the
Mm.
most important. Can you just explain to us the psychology of Marina? What gives her this sort of like audacity to feel like she could go from an administrative assistant to one of the most powerful? No, actually, I should rephrase that to the most powerful football executive, women football executive during that time.
Well, I think, yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I know why you'd use a word like audacity. I completely get it, but I think that what happened in her career is that uh, she that she was working for Sibneft and straight out of university, and Roman Abramovich identified her as somebody he thought was capable and and very hardworking, and he effectively headhunted her to work with him, and then she's worked with him ever since. And I think one of the things that would probably shatter a lot of stereotypes about Russia would be if that Roman Abramovich is always somebody who's promoted on merit and has never been scared to to promote women or people from different backgrounds or all these sorts of things. And so obviously Marina would fall into that category. And just over time, there were points when in the early days at Chelsea when if he couldn't be there, if he couldn't make meetings in person, he'd need somebody to be his eyes and ears. And sometimes that would be Marina, and sometimes it would be people like Eugene Tenenbaum or others. But increasingly, it became Marina. And then when Frank Arneson was sacked, they needed a new sporting director, somebody to focus on transfers, and actually, effectively, Marina stepped in, but then stayed, proved herself and stayed in that role and never looked back after that. And effectively, as it was explained to me from a number of people, she effectively said, look, I can do this. Roman Abramovich said, well, if you think you can, then do, and let's see what happens, basically. And it will either work or not. And I mean, it did work. And I think the Drogba and Elka situation was the test case, and that obviously ended very well. And I think that was the thing that cemented her position and backing from Roman Abramovich. And really, people who know her very well say that she would never have said she had any sort of deep understanding of football, but that she's uh, very astute when it comes to understanding people. And I think that she understood in the situation, or she felt that Drogba needed to be treated, to be managed in a slightly different way from a lot of the other players, and that she felt like he needed an arm around his shoulder and to feel loved and respected and valued. And she felt that if he was given all of those things, and if he felt like that, then he could perform to his peak, and they could get the best out of him. And obviously he went on to be a pivotal figure in Chelsea's 2012 Champions League win, and I suppose the rest is history. But I think there's a really interesting sort of touchstone about just kind of football management and off-field management in general, which is you absolutely have to have your tactical and technical expertise and knowledge within a system, but you've got to have people who see the soft skills as well. You've got to have people who understand what people need and what makes them tick, and how to provide them with all that sort of pastoral support and care to get the best out of them. And I think that it's not something that anyone else has sort of talked to me about in this way, but I do slightly wonder if some of that understanding that Marina brought to the situation could perhaps have been cultural, in that you think that obviously there've been lots of African players in the Premier League and some phenomenal players who've come to the Premier League and taken it by storm. But there's also been a lot of African players who never quite settled in the Premier League, never quite felt comfortable. I think you could see almost in their surroundings, and you could see some very talented players over the years not quite find their niche. And I've always wondered, this is just me supposing, but I've always wondered if sometimes some of that is cultural, and people in the UK not necessarily understanding some of those cultural touchstones and some of the pressure points, and not understanding them well enough in order to provide the players with what they need, but also perhaps not understanding the players' reactions and potentially emotional reactions to certain situations, which could be more culture based than and background based than anything else. And if they're different, if those reactions are different or potentially more emotional than, say, a very typical sort of English stiff upper lip type reaction, then perhaps a player is misunderstood, if that makes sense, and then maybe mischaracterized. So obviously, with Drogba, of course, he could be very sort of fiery and tempestuous. But in the end, Chelsea harnessed that, didn't they, to their perfect advantage. And actually, I think one of the strengths of the Chelsea teams at their best over the Abramovich era was some of that fire. And it was clear that teams would at times be scared to play Chelsea when they had, Terry and Carvalho and Ashley Cole and, Makelele, all these players, and Drogba, and, they were, and I think the best thing for Drogba, and I think it's probably a great thing for African football more widely, is that he was harnessed to become a talisman. And I think it's really great for, lots of footballers from different backgrounds who would have come beyond him. It's so great that sort of was successful. And I think now, everything moves on very quickly, doesn't it? And you'd like to think that the game understands all of these things now better than it perhaps did then. And so hopefully there's a sort of very solid methodology for helping people, adapt to different cultures and living in different countries and these things. But yeah, so I think that was, something that she has this, she seemed, certainly people who know her well say that she has, sort of innate ability to read people and understand how to get the best out of them.
Yeah.
And I think that, that's something that, it is where, and it's a big generalization, right? But perhaps that's, often those sorts of soft skills are the sorts of things that, perhaps women can bring to the table that where men potentially can't. And, like I said before, it takes all, you want a team of a leadership team that provides you with all those skills. And there'll be plenty of men who can do that obviously brilliantly as well. But it's about balance, isn't it? And so I think, through time, Chelsea did find that balance in their leadership structure, and it paid off handsomely.
Yeah, it's a clear point you make there about understanding the cultural nuance. But also, if you look at Jude Bellingham, he's British. He's from the UK. So it's also, we also need to remember that not everyone fits a certain type of box or profile, because if we take Jude as an example, if his temperament should be, or even Wayne Rooney, both are similar characters in terms of how the temperaments are. If you dim their light, then the football goes down. Also, they come together. That you can't have a high performing player with that sort of like temperament, then try to dim that temperament and not expect his playing skills to go down. So they come together, in my opinion. But in terms of like women having this more innate way of confronting difficult situations. You illustrated this very well with Emma Hayes in terms of how she was able to lead the Chelsea women to another trophy, but also in terms of how she dealt with the media. I mean, Thomas Tuchel also did that very well. Obviously, he's well known for being eloquent and intelligent with the way he communicates to the media and also to his players. And so, yeah, that was very well illustrated in the book, and I really enjoyed that part of the book. But so moving towards the actual sales process and obviously dealing with the investment bank Reigns in this case, the central figure here was Todd Bowley. Obviously, he's the current co-owner of the club now. Blue Co. His consortium ultimately won, but there were other several serious bidders, including the Ricketts family, which had issues with things that the patriarch actually mentioned on email. And then obviously Stephen Peluca's group was also a bidder, and obviously Jim Ratcliffe trying to disrupt things. Not sure how sincere he was about his bid. But from a strategic point, from what I noticed, and I'll get to my question, Todd Bowley was very strategic, the way he approached the whole thing. Why is that? Why was it clear from your narration in the book? It was clear to me that Todd Bowley had the plan from the get-go on how he was going to ultimately have the keys to Chelsea. Why was it different for him as opposed to the other well-equipped, well-funded, well-capitalized bidders and consortium?
Yeah. Well, I think they definitely, Todd Bowley definitely had an advantage from having, explored a potential Chelsea purchase previously in 2018 and into 2019. And while that situation never got to the stage of making a bid, a lot of due diligence was done at the time. Now, all of that due diligence had to start again afresh in 2022. And I think everyone involved would say that didn't give Todd or Badad or Clearlake any sort of major advantage. I think also, and I understand that, but I think because obviously, the due diligence had to start from scratch, everything had changed. 3 years had passed, Chelsea was in a different situation, and obviously was being sold as a distressed asset, which was, extremely unusual. But on top of that, there was a residual benefit. And I think that's that, Todd Bowley had been able to spend time with Chelsea's owners and Chelsea's senior leadership team and understand probably what made them tick, a little bit about how the club had been successful and why. And I think they're very smart in the way they distilled that into their bid for the club. And certainly one of the key reasons why, in the end, all the final bidders had effectively made the same monetary offer for the club. So then it came down to nuance and detail in terms of who would be successful. And in the end, Todd Bowley and Badad Eghbali were able to, along with their other partners, and obviously clearly Clearlake within that, Todd and Badad were able to exude lots of the qualities that would chime the most with Marina Granovskaia and Bruce Buck, who were two of the key people in running the sale process and making the ultimate decision on who would win the race to buy Chelsea. And so I think it was always important for Roman Abramovich to pass Chelsea on to a new set of custodians who could continue it in the style to which it had been accustomed. Yeah, in the end, I think Todd and Badad were able to prove they were the closest fit. So I think, there was a lot of benefit, probably that residual benefit from 2018, 2019. And a lot of that's actually in the softer side of things, none of it to do with the detail. So yeah, I think they did a very good job there. They were very smart and, like you say, strategic, and in terms of how they presented, how they would take it forward, and it was quite. I think it was very astute in stressing their desire to build on the legacy of Roman Abramovich rather than take it apart. And so yeah, I think that was key to their success, really.
Yeah, and obviously Boris Johnson was also a significant player in this, not so much in the sporting side, in terms of making sure that the UK government stance was quite clear and obviously potentially influenced by the Americans, because everything they do is lockstep in most cases. Yeah, so specifically around how Bruce Buck was basically able to liaise between Chelsea as a club and also the government regulators, and using his sort of like his knowledge as a lawyer, diplomatic nuance in that sense. How does his sort of like strategy contrast with Maria? I mentioned this only because in the book you mentioned that Maria was willing to go to the wall when it came to just to see if the government was bluffing when it came to the actual May 31st deadline. So am I fair in my assessment that they have contrasting sort of like approach when it came to dealing with this highly stressful situation?
Yeah, potentially. That's interesting, actually, because in terms of, I'll be honest, I'm not actually entirely sure whether Bruce Buck would have chimed with Marina's view there or whether he would have disagreed. But definitely the prevailing view was that, Marina was the one, as it was explained to me, having the strongest view of, basically they can't do this and they don't have the guts effectively to do it. So if we stand firm and say we'll just, we will sell the club, but we'll run this process at our own pace, at a normal pace, then they would have to let us do that. But I think it was sorry, excuse me. I think it was the other people. It was a group of people who would have kind of brought her back from that and convinced her that was a bad idea. And I think really that how that consensus was reached was the fact that that government was quite unpredictable, and so in many situations, if you have a moderate, prudent, sensible, not moderate, prudent government that would, wouldn't really colour outside the lines or wouldn't necessarily take bold steps, then you could potentially model their behaviour. But I think they thought it was probably quite difficult to make predictions on how the government would react to things. But then also beyond that, if you stand up to a government, they can always effectively win just by default, right? So that, they make the rules, and if they decide to enforce them, there's not really any way to stop that from happening. So eventually, I think everybody realised that there was merit in that approach, and perhaps it would have worked, but also it was extremely risky, and it was too big a risk. And and clearly everyone's love for Chelsea and duty of care for the club, not just the club, but all the staff and the players in the club, but also beyond that, the supporters and all of the businesses, all of these sort of auxiliary businesses that don't exist if Chelsea doesn't exist. All of these things were in people's minds when they decided not to do that, because there's 500 and maybe more than 500 businesses in the borough in Chelsea that wouldn't exist if Chelsea didn't exist. Matchday businesses, enterprises, and similar. So, I mean, that's got to be more than 1,000 jobs that are linked to Chelsea, but they're not people who are employed by Chelsea, right? So that's even before you think about how many people the club employs. And at one point in the UK, Roman Abramovich employed more than 1,000 people. So there's a lot of people whose livelihoods were riding on this. And in the end, everyone at Chelsea, obviously, when they thought about that in detail and considered the picture in the round, they knew that it was too much of a risk, and they would be gambling with people's futures, and that just wasn't a fair or a just thing to do.
Yeah, it's a fair point, especially as you said. When the government sets the rules, you're just playing the government's game, and your best bet is to find a way to play the game as well as you can. You can't beat the person who creates the game in that sense. So by default, like you said, you're always going to be at the mercy of the government, especially on a predictable government, as you say. But in terms of sort of like the fact that Chelsea was then sold, no mistaken, for world record price at that time for a sports franchise, which was remarkable if you consider the fact that it's been sold as a distressed asset in a very tight time frame. So even that is like a remarkable stat in its own right. What would you say were the drivers for this high valuation at the time?
Well, I think it's and I think it's fascinating because if it hadn't been sold as a distressed asset, I think the price would have been at least £1 billion more. And I think that what we see with obviously after Todd, Bowley, and Clearlake took control of the club, they've invested hugely heavily in the playing squad, for example, and with the club generally. But I think part of that is because actually they considered the purchase itself a really good deal. And so I think there was a quick, relatively quick investment of something around £1 billion into the playing squad, and obviously that garnered a lot of attention. But I think that's that's money that could easily have been spent purchasing the club itself in a different set of circumstances. So that's not to say that that doesn't dampen the level of investment in many ways, but you can see the rationale in thinking, well, that's money we would have invested in, in the first place purely to take control of the club. So that's still money we want to spend. So you can almost see that as they perhaps felt like that was a bonus investment opportunity to put the club in a strong footing for the future, signing lots of young players, tying them down to long-term contracts, and hopefully kind of creating a solid squad base for the long term. But yeah, I think remarkably, given the growth of the Premier League since Roman Abramovich transformed Chelsea, I think it's clear that American investors see another massive scope for further growth in the Premier League's future. I think we're seeing this there's no shortage of American business people who want to invest in the Premier League now. And in many ways, I think you can see why, although it's sort of scary, isn't it, when you think about the numbers and you think about how far football's come in that terms of economic growth, and the idea that the idea that it could, do something, jump on the same as far again in the next sort of 10 years or 15 years, in comparison to American sports, you can see the rationale and why people would think that, wouldn't you? I mean, look at the Lakers deal that's just gone through now, and even at the time straight after the sale of Chelsea, obviously Harris and Blitzer were the backers for Sir Martin Broughton's bid, and once they were unsuccessful with Chelsea, they bought the Washington Commanders, didn't they? For an even, and that was another record purchase, was $6 billion, I think, but it was another, certainly eclipsed the Chelsea sale, and again only speaks to the fact that clearly some of the world's most successful business people, who clearly get their predictions right. Do you know what I mean? They prove that over time, don't they? The numbers don't lie, and so they obviously spend their lives analyzing and forecasting, and obviously from those analyses and forecasts, they believe that the Premier League has another boom in it, which is and so I think that's precisely why there was this there was the clamour to buy Chelsea, and then because the demand was so high, then they could set a price to reflect that.
Yeah, it's a good point you make. Numbers don't lie, indeed, and Chelsea, in that sense, having people who have like high financial, intelligence, and obviously use foresight, as you say, in forecasting and analysis, and obviously have tons of, high-paid lawyers to make sure that everything potentially would result in a high valuation for Chelsea when they do decide to sell. Also on point. And I do agree with Americans actually when it comes to the fact that there's still a new era of growth for the Premier League, and not just the Premier League, football rights as a whole. I do think, obviously, as the increased globalization, as more countries have more of the middle class increase and more productivity across the board in different developing countries, I do think football rights will become even more valuable. That's a thesis that I do agree with the Americans in that sense. That's probably where my agreement with them begins and ends. But one thing I'm very fascinated by is the fact that Chelsea supporters group, in my opinion, were probably the most powerful supporters group in, let me not overstretch it and say Europe, but I would say in England. I only say this because in the book you document that they were tremendously effective in terms of organization, terms of being able to derail the Super League and actually be instrumental making Chelsea become the first actual club to withdraw from it. And then obviously when we now focus on the sale of Chelsea, the Chelsea supporters group to me sounds like a highly efficient check and balance for potential owners. Someone who understands the Chelsea ecosystem, what learnings can other support group, fan groups learn from the Chelsea group? Or is it just a coincidence that they are well organized and had like a stroke of luck when it came to the Super League?
Yeah, no, I don't think it is a coincidence. I mean, there's the Stamford Bridge is owned by the Chelsea Pitch Owners Association, so that's a separate association which effectively ensures that people can buy shares into that, and that effectively ensures that Chelsea stay at Stamford Bridge, and the club would have to strike an agreement with them if they were ever to leave the ground. So that's a historic situation that obviously it would be sort of impossible for other clubs to replicate, but that gives influence and power to the supporters base, which is a good starting point. Because obviously, while it's extremely rare in football, obviously teams do move. We saw it with MK Dons and things, and that's the worst case scenario for any football fan, and it's certainly not something that would, not suggesting for a second that would happen with Chelsea, but it's always, like you say, great to have these checks and balances. And then the Chelsea supporters trust at the time, were very well organised, very well run, and able to, and sometimes they have to take strong positions with quite bold statements in order to get their message across. And I think they're quite smart with how they go about these things, running polls of members to poll members' opinions, and then only acting off the back of the members' wishes. And I think that's the way it should be. It's really really smart. The way the sale unfolded with governmental intervention and oversight meant that everybody who was trying to bid for Chelsea felt they needed to publicise their bids in an unprecedented fashion, and honestly, to the point where, as journalists, we were receiving, I'm not alone in this. A lot of the other reporters who were covering Chelsea regularly were receiving the same kinds of phone calls. But you would be receiving phone calls from people attached to high net worth individuals saying, "This is the person I represent. They're going to bid for Chelsea, and we'd like you to effectively announce that in a story." And so, there might never be another situation where that's replicated, because normally, clearly, in these sorts of situations, it's not unusual for a sale of a club effectively to be announced as a done deal. Or very close to. It might be something that it only comes to light in the latter stages of a deal, right? But in this situation, nothing had happened. Even before anything had happened, people were saying, "I'm going to bid for Chelsea. This is my, this is what my pitch, this is what I'll do," and that was because people needed to gain governmental approval. So people needed to prove that they were fit and proper owners, suitable owners, could take Chelsea forward would have the wherewithal, the financial resources, and everything that would come with that, and were of good enough standing to do it. And that's where, obviously, then the supporters trust would come in, with meeting with the bidders, and just to kind of see the lay of the land and see and take. And I think their approach was something along the lines of, well, if the government are going to do this, then we should probably see if we can do likewise. And I think there's definitely a situation there of, sometimes if you don't ask, you don't get. So they were right to put themselves in a position to to have some influence. And I mean, certainly, and some of that also was just the way things unfolded with with Paul Canaville and his involvement. That was fairly fluid. But I mean, obviously the Ricketts family had a lot of work to do just in explaining their kind of views and sensitivities, and to try to prove that they would be considered suitable owners. So that is how all of that came about. But I think it is really crucial in this time for elite clubs to have mobilised and focused and organised, but also respectful and measured supporter groups, supporter associations. And I think within that, there's probably a delicate balance to be struck between building and fostering good working relationships with the football club and the key individuals at the football club, but also holding them to account. And I think that's probably the most difficult part of that role, because, as we're seeing it now and the CST have backed the Football Supporters Association, their latest campaign about ticket prices, and I think that that's exactly right. There'll always be tension there, won't there, on the two sides. You can completely understand why, having invested so much money and having taken on such a massive asset, and in considering financial terms and from a business standpoint, you can completely understand why owners want to make those forward steps fiscally. But that completely will always create tension with supporters, and clearly, when you mentioned, TV rights, and especially for the Premier League, one of the key reasons why the Premier League television rights are so, can command such massive figures is because of the partisan support. And if clubs price out supporters, the partisan supporters, the passionate supporters, the long-term supporters, if they're priced out of being able to attend matches, then actually the Premier League would be creating a potential problem for itself in its TV, global TV rights saleability, because it's that passion, isn't it? And it's that atmosphere that really creates the drama in itself. We see the players feed off it all the time. We know this. But if the people who have that ardent fire and passion for their team can't be in the stands, then that will start to fade, and that could create a problem, couldn't it? So the supporters are, and always will be, really important. And even in that financial ecosystem, they are important as well. That's something that probably is good. It would be good for supporters to know and keep in mind, because I think they've probably always got a bit more power in this sort of relationship than perhaps they feel, because they're part of the asset, aren't they? They're part of the saleable product, and without them, the product isn't saleable. And like every other modern business, it's required to kind of keep going up, isn't it, in terms of value and all those things. And so I think it's I think there's a lot of lessons there from the Chelsea fans and how they managed to have an influence, and they definitely did have an influence.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's a playbook for other fan groups to look at and try to emulate. I would definitely be deep diving into it and to see what learnings can be shared to other lower league supporters trust group across Europe. But just to wrap up, we have a quick Q&A round. Basically, I ask you a quick question and you give me the first few thoughts as a response that comes to mind. First question would be, looking back now after writing this book, what would you say is the legacy for Roman Abramovich, let's say 10 years from now?
He transformed football. He was the first of the super owners. The Premier League couldn't be what it is without him. I think his legacy at Chelsea should be, will probably remain intact and separate from everything else. Chelsea supporters regard him extremely highly. I think that overall, he's one of the key pillars that's turned the Premier League into the global force it is.
Second question is, do you think Todd Bowley would have the same seismic impact on football that he's had in other sports, but also probably close to what Roman has had for Chelsea and football?
I think Todd and Todd Bowley and Clearlake have a much more difficult job than Roman Abramovich did, just by virtue of the fact that Roman Abramovich was the first person. So he created that paradigm shift, and then everyone else was scrambling to catch up with him. So massive investment on its own won't shift the paradigm now. But Todd and Badad and Jose Feliciano and the other partners, they know that. I think they can do something similar, but it'd be very difficult to outstrip other similarly funded, backed, potent forces. And I think that's the Premier League now, in many ways, it's harder to win a Premier League title than it is to win the Champions League. I think that's probably evidenced by Chelsea's Champions League win in 2021. They were a team at that point that just couldn't have won the Premier League. Thomas Tuchel, I think, is very, very good at creating a cup team. And I mean that as the biggest compliment, in that a team that can beat any one team in any one-off match, that can almost be greater than the sum of its parts for individual matches. And a lot of that is down to do with really astute tactical abilities. And so, but you can't do that 38 times in a season. I think you just can't. So, I think it's impossible to know whether they can replicate what Roman Abramovich has done. But what I can definitely say is that from my experiences of meeting with him and talking with him and with the other owners, they are very, very determined to do that. And it's a massive motivator to replicate, the success with the Dodgers, for example. And I think that when somebody like Todd Bowley sets their sights on success, I think they will pull out all the stops to get there. So it's something that I think Chelsea fans can be encouraged by, albeit that there's been a quite turbulent few years.
Yeah, from everything I've gathered so far, I think Todd will definitely have an impact on football in Europe and specifically on Chelsea. So I do think Chelsea fans will be obviously of significant benefits of his actions. As you said, he's a very tenacious individual. So last question, this is a selfish question. So from my reading of your book, my favorite parts of the book were the sort of like the deal making, the sort of like the back and forth, the pressure, those elements of the book were tremendous for me. So it's a two-part question. So the first one is, I've asked this a lot to all the guests. What's the book that has shaped you as a person? So what book has shaped you the most? And then the second part of the question would be, from what I've gathered, I feel like you potentially have lots of books coming up in the course of your career. Would you selfishly indulge me and write books that are more geared towards thrillers around deal making, the backs and forth when it comes to negotiating, and particularly around the financial side of the sports industry and football potentially?
Wow, what book? Oh, it'd be really hard to pick one book that kind of shaped me, but I think but books definitely have. And so my undergraduate degree was in classics, so Latin, ancient Greek, ancient history, philosophy, those sorts of things. So, I was extremely lucky to have been able to study Latin and ancient Greek at school, and then did likewise at university, purely because it was slightly unusual, and I felt like, when would you have an opportunity again to do something like this? And so, my sort of choices on that would be something fairly left field, but I'd be looking at something like, genuinely, and this sounds a bit sort of lofty, but it's not supposed to, but I'd be looking at something like Virgil's Aeneid, which in itself was actually the first piece of propaganda, really, because through an epic poem and a storytelling, he links, Aeneas, the hero, he leaves the fall of Troy and then travels and effectively ultimately ends up and founds Rome. And so Virgil then traces the lineage, Aeneas, this fictional character, Aeneas' lineage, to Octavian, who has renamed himself Augustus as emperor, and to become effectively the first emperor of Rome that Romans would accept as a de facto tyrant, really, but obviously packaged up in a different way. So it's such a sophisticated way to create your own sort of claim, there by the grace of God to effectively a throne, but Romans wouldn't accept a king or a tyrant. So emperor becomes a title, and and then the argument becomes that obviously Augustus is descended from Aeneas, who founded Rome, therefore that he sort of he should be ruling Rome by birth. And it's this remarkable, it's a remarkable story in its own right, but when considered in a round of its sort of political sophistication, absolutely mind-blowing, actually, really, even to think that this all happened 2000 years ago. And now sort of that's what, 31 BC, 31, yeah, sorry. And you're sort of thinking that almost this sort of that could happen, something so sophisticated could be happening at such a early stage of, I suppose, human development. So yeah, that's kind of always been something that has stayed with me, and so there'd be a few others of that sort of ilk as well. But then more latterly, reading someone like Robert Harris and his absolutely incredible books, clearly sort of Conclave and Fatherland and many more. But before he was writing novels, he was a phenomenally talented political journalist, and there was an amazing piece in the Sunday Times he was in the sort of Blair camp the night that they won the 97 election. So here's a massive piece in the paper about fly on the wall piece about the night that they won the election. He's obviously the only journalist in the room. So that was an amazing piece of access that must have taken years and years and years to garner, but also the way he was able to put that out there was absolutely fantastic. So that's probably still available to get hold of somewhere in the archives, and I would urge anyone to look at that, because I think access is so difficult to come by, and access like that especially, I think these are the sorts of things that give unrivaled, kind of portraits and of of some very, very high profile people.
Yeah, it's completely agree with you, and you can also say the parallels between that time in Rome and our time where we have would-be emperors, or people who want to be emperors in different nation states. But yeah, thank you so much, Nick. Thank you for coming on to the Football Economy. That was awesome deep dive into Chelsea, the sale, the players, and the tension and political drama that you put together in a very marvelous book that I urge anyone listening to this to suggest to other people and also to read themselves. So thank you again for coming on.
No, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
And yeah, that's a wrap for this episode with Nick. And I implore anyone listening to this to subscribe, like, and share with like-minded individuals who are interested into the section of sports, organizational factors, business, and the operational side of football. Until next time, take care and have a good one. Bye.